Hi everyone, just waiting. Okay, let's see. Okay, we have 12 people. Welcome to this webinar. I don't know if everyone can hear me properly. The echo behind, I'm not quite sure. All right. So we'll just wait maybe 30 seconds, 1 minute until people arrive. Just you can tell me in the chat if there's an echo. Just let me know because I hear echo right now. So I just want to make sure that you can hear me properly. Just wait a little bit. Okay, if no one writes in the chat, I will assume you can hear me properly. Okay, so welcome to this webinar. Today I hear an echo. Okay, the big echo. That's what I thought. Okay. Okay, there's an echo apparently. Okay, this time. Okay. All right. Anyway, so we'll be. I hope you can hear me properly. So today we'll be discussing the topic of AI with Tristan. So we provide tech and data courses online, master classes, and working independently on our platform online. We have data science, data engineering, data analyst, or the tech courses. And more specifically today, we'll be focusing on the AI part and more applied AI ethics. Applied AI ethics, how we can navigate the path of AI. So, Tristan today is a specialist question, and he's a public speaker, freelance consultant, and he's been doing those presentations for a while now. He knows a lot on the topic, and I will leave the floor to him right now because I think there still might be an echo. I hope it will be working better with him. Do not hesitate to ask questions, and Tristan will make his best to answer those at the end as thoroughly as possible. Have a good webinar.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Very excited for my third webinar with you this year. And I wanted to talk topic of AI ethics or applied AI. I'm talking about artificial intelligence strategist, public speaker, and the founder of the AI Strategy Institute at BCG. I'm elected at Munich Business School, and I used to build up one of the largest AI founders and was an AI strategist at that. Share a little bit about what I do and mean with applied AI. I had, when working with this, coming up all the time and then hands-on without kind of should be done, but what are actually the issues. A little bit for today, the structure of ethics, then what are the challenges when we go into the model, into the system, and then when people come in. So point, and then we zoom out and see what maybe talking about some strategies. So, but let's start. And I think about artificial intelligence and regulations came up with, and for me, a little bit sometimes parallels from history, relation of AI reminds relation of the cars and how we were interesting. So when cars first so scared of the technology that required people by law to off the cars to with a flag to car was coming. And second, what you think the color mind, just think about it, what was the, and it was obviously red, where the word red flag is coming up when we speak from this part. And it was later people realized too harsh and they abolished it and came up with it. Nevertheless, what we have to realize, the AI, they pose a threat and there's can happen. So we not only have, we have a couple of things to reduce the harm that we commit with it and to make our streets safer. To take a driver license.
Tristan, I'm just cutting you. I think we have a big issue with the audio, so I think it would be better to maybe disconnect and reconnect the live. Because people can't hear properly, and there's obviously a big issue here, unfortunately.
And you want me to go back
maybe
in again?
I think the best, maybe try to disconnect yourself and come back and see if that works better. Because really right now it's difficult for people to hear. Okay. Hi everyone. Sorry for the interruption. Tristan will be back in 1 sec. Hopefully it will work better after that. It's much better now. Okay, yeah. Thank you, Suvik. I think that the issue was probably coming from Tristan's side. Unfortunately, we only saw that just a few minutes before the beginning of the start. So Tristan is back. Tristan, can you try to speak again and see if that works better?
Stage. So can you hear me now?
Better. Now it's working. Perfect. I'll leave the stage to you again. Thank you.
Okay, then I share my screen again. Give me a second. So basically, as I was saying, we have a lot of kind of ways how we want to make our streets safer. So we require people to take a driver's license. We have put in regulations in place that people have to wear a belt. We require manufacturers of cars to have these airbags. But still, driving is still one of the kind of most common way how people die. And even though we have all the regulation around cars and trying to make streets safer, there are still people that don't care so much about regulation and decide to use the cars to cause real harm, for instance, to drive into the crowds and commit a crime. So when we're talking about AI ethics, it is actually a little bit more and encompass more than just kind of the regulation part. And what I'm always saying is kind of when people ask me what is the difference between ethics and regulation, I say, well, you can still abide to all of the to the laws you have on the street and kind of drive more or less kind of don't cross the red lights, but you can be still a total dick in traffic. So AI ethics kind of is, or in general, what is ethics doing is kind of the values that tell us what is good. These are the things we should strive for, desire, and seek out to protect. These are principles that tell us what is right, outlining how we may or may not achieve our values. And the purpose is our reason of being. It gives us the life to your values and principles. And quite often, so my background is economics and philosophy, and quite often what we do when we're talking about ethics and philosophy, we think about very extreme scenarios, such as the trolley problem. So the trolley problem is basically this idea: trolley is coming and you have the choice. Do you push the lever and kill these 5 workers, or do you push the lever and just this one person is killed? And there are different variations of the trolley problems where you have these thought experiment. And what I realized is kind of like coming from these philosophical part, that these thought experiments that we have often in AI don't really serve us often quite well if we want to understand how should we build ethical AI solutions. So while we're talking about AI ethics, well, AI ethics focus on the consideration that stakeholders must keep in mind to ensure that artificial intelligence is developed and deployed responsibly. And the goal is really to avoid causing harm. And this is achieved by adhering to principle of safety, security, trustworthiness, and now even more and more, we're talking about environmental sustainability. And why is this so important? This is so important because AI operates at a much larger scale and speed than human. So if you make one mistake or one potential for harm, this means it can significantly amplify it and things can go awry. So let's then dig a little bit deeper and go into the different categories from data to zooming out to the model and how people might react with an AI system, and talk a little bit about some issues that we see here. And the first part that I'd like to talk about is data. And maybe also kind of like before I start talking about this, going a step back, when we're talking about kind of like this, all these laws and regulations, something that I realized when we working with the startups, if you think compliance and regulation to be really kind of like a challenge that you have to do, it becomes much more challenging. If you switch your mindset a little bit and think about that AI ethics is something that you want to do because it can show customers that what you're doing is actually ethical and aligned, it can really become a value add. And it's just kind of like the change of mindset. So let's go a little bit into data. And to explain you kind of like the intricacies with data, and when we talk about GDPR, I want to give you this kind of like example. Imagine you going to the doctors to get kind of like your STDs checked. And even though everything is negative and so on, would you like this information of your STD test to be publicly made available? Like if there would be your name and there's kind of like a list of the things? Probably not. But very interesting, this data is still useful and we can still use it without even kind of like making your specific results available. And this is what we do all the time, right? So this information, even though it's useful for you, it's also useful for instance, if we do it in Germany or globally, this information is also useful when we aggregate it, right? So for instance, imagine come back with a positive test, then this is something we want to keep in the statistics to understand what is actually going on a global space. And having you in the statistics without having your name is in a way that is not kind of like threatening to you. So what we need to understand when we're talking about data, there are different versions of data. And we're talking about here kind of like different levels of data, from kind of like public data. This is data that is publicly available, including business data, things that we can find easily on the internet, all the way up to really restricted data and highly sensitive data. And if you are working on your AI startup or whatsoever, you should have a very good sense and understanding what type of data it is and what level it might belong to, because depending on the level, you have to do certain things. And one of the things that you have to do is we're talking about data privacy and data security, which is not the same. So data privacy is the compliance with data protection laws and regulation. And this much focus on how to collect, process, share, archive, and delete the data. Whereas data security measures that an organization is taking in order to prevent any third party from unauthorized risks. So these are not the same things. They're slightly different, but you will have to do those and adhere to do those. And this is not something that we do because, or regulation does because they are mean, but there's a reason why we're doing this. And one of the reasons why this happened, or one of the example, is the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where they basically could just take the data, take very private data, and use this to make predictions and actually manipulate you, in the example of Cambridge Analytica, to vote in certain directions. And one of the points, or one of the results, because at least in Europe, we said we don't want to have this, we want to protect people, was the GDPR. So I'm not a GDPR expert, just kind of like as a small disclaimer, but I give you some of the flavor. So the protection of a natural person in relation to the processing of personal data is a fundamental right. And very much a lot of things that we do around data, or we can't do around the data that we have here in Germany and Europe, are really based on GDPR. So what is kind of like some of the understanding, or one kind of like this insights that you should kind of like intuitively understand? And the first thing we need to understand, there are different types, again, of data. There's personal data, so your name, your email address, for instance, your phone number. There are special categories. It could be your criminal records, your medical records. So these are the things you definitely don't want to share with anyone, or that they want to be out. And there's not personal data. So which companies I'm working for, what is the email address of my company, maybe if I'm male or female. So these are things that I don't really mind that are out there. And what we have to understand, one part of kind of like this idea of GDPR, that you can remain anonymous and people can't use the data to find you. So if you look at the data and kind of like a data profile of a person, if you look at the full data, that means we have some items or some data points that will help to identify you, and some that don't make you identifiable. And depending on what you're working on and how you're working with the customers, you have to think differently if you want to apply with GDPR. There's one way where you can work with personal sensitive data, so you have everything like there is, right? Then you can pseudonymize the data, so you have this data and you don't see the person anymore, but you get this information, for instance, this special information about the health status. And then there's anonymous data, so there's not even kind of like the specific label that you have. There's no way kind of like the ID is removed. There's no way how you can go back. So the question is, depending on the problem you're solving, to understand, do you have kind of like go from personal data to pseudonymized data, or do you have to go from pseudonymized data to anonymous data? And what is the difference? So it means pseudonymization means here we have a key, right? We have our personal information, there's a key in the middle, and we have the pseudonymized data. That means the person who has the key, if you have the key, you can go from basically the pseudonymized data and you can map it back to the original person. The difference with anonymization, this anonymized data and this personal information is irreversible. So you should, in your best way, you should not be able to understand, based on an anonymized data, who the actual person is. If you can make it irreversible, then it's not anonymized. And depending on what you're doing, kind of like the level of information will basically go down more and more until you reach kind of like an acceptable risk for not being able to re-identify the person. And this is something actually you have to do, or should do at the beginning, trying to understand what data is you collecting for your problem or in your company and how you have to treat it. And they're kind of like different layers, or kind of like different ways, kind of different risks associated with the data. And what I find very interesting about, and this has nothing to do yet per se with AI. Obviously, AI is trained on data, so it's very important. But this is kind of like it, independent of if you're doing AI or not. What I find quite interesting is that AI actually can help you to anonymize data, pseudonymize data, and comply with GDPR if you think smartly. And this is something I realized kind of like from the startup mentality. Even if people say from the GDPR perspective, this is not working, there's often always a way around. And this is the tricky part about GDPR, that even though it's a law, it's not clear kind of like what it takes. And this means if you ask 40 GDPR experts what they think about your solution, you will probably get 40 different answers that will kind of like mean if you can do things or cannot do things. And I think this is one of the most dangerous things about the GDPR, that they're like everyone has a slightly different opinion about it. And a lot of people that have an opinion about it really don't have any clue about GDPR, because everyone has heard about it. Everyone sees, okay, well, we understand GDPR, but they often don't understand what you can do and how you can kind of like be GDPR compliant. And AI can help you to do this. So for instance, if you have kind of like here images,
you can basically, this is the original image, you can use, for instance, precision blur. This is AI automatically where your face is blurred, so you can't identify this person anymore. You can have a full body blur. Or what you can also do is deep natural anonymization. So basically you see here the face is, in this example, not so much, but kind of like completely changed, but you have still the appearance and the natural look, but it's just kind of like a different person. So there's things you can do. Or for instance, what you could do is kind of like similar to this, where you're working in a store and you can track the customers, but you can just basically blur the people so you cannot detect who they are, but you don't need to know who they are. You maybe just need to know if this person is a customer or not a customer. Or for instance, in the medical field, I used to work for an AI radiology startup. What they basically, or what we basically do is with CT scans, you can basically, if you have the CT scan of a brain, you can remake the 3D face, so it's not GDPR compliant. So what we did is with AI, we cut off the face. So we defaced and de-aired the people, so we cannot recognize who is the person anymore. So AI can very much be a way how to circumvent or how to be GDPR compliant. We can also think about synthetical data. So all these faces that you see are actually no real faces. And we can think about, if you need a big data set, how you can basically use this original data to create a synthetic data set, or have a partially synthetic data set to have data that where you can train the people on. And I have seen this, for instance, in order to build MVPs. For instance, in insurance, where people have used, for instance, ChatGPT to generate synthetic data. They said, for instance, in insurance, when there were insurance complaints, said, okay, well, generate me please 100 insurance complaints of people that I can use. And you have different kind of like artificial created insurance complaints of people, and then they trained their models on that. So this is something I find very interesting, and kind of like, because if you're working with synthetic data, there's actually next to zero risk of a data breach. And what I find very interesting is, like, I worked with a lot of startups that had very creative ways how to overcome this challenge of you cannot collect data because you're not GDPR compliant yet, or because they were in the medical field and didn't have the all the right medical certifications yet. But often you have to start with data, and you have to get the data somewhere. And this was a startup. Basically, they measure how big how much liquid is in a bladder. So for people who can't feed their bladder anymore and are incontinent, they have to pee somehow. And the people, because there's a medical device, were not allowed yet to collect the data. So what they did instead is they went internally, and all the people in the startup were actually wearing this belt and collecting their own data. So they had data that they can train on, and where they had the consent to use the data. So what I want to say with this, and what mentality I want to give you, is there is probably always, so no, not always means no. And there's always somehow kind of like a smart workaround. And if you're speaking with GDPR experts, don't ask them if this is possible or not, but ask them always, or if you speak with legal person, always ask them, well, what can I do to make this possible? Because, I mean, these people are trained to spot a risk, and there's always a risk, but they never quantify how big the risk is. And you should always, if you speak to them, ask them, well, what could I do to make this possible? And not ask them, is this possible? Yes or no, because then they'll always say yes or no, or then most of the time they say no, because they see the risk, and they will not tell you what could be a workaround. So now going one step higher, not data anymore, and the model. And obviously here what we have is a lot of bias, a lot of instances of bias is something, I mean, there has been talking a lot about this, especially biased against marginalized groups. So here you see an example. I think this is provided by Algorithm Watch, where you have here image detection. And if you see kind of like the black hand, the image would see a hand and a gun, but just kind of like blurring in white or changing the color. It's not a gun anymore. It's a monocular, and it seems it's biased against the color of the skin. Similar, here's an example about the gender shades study. It's actually very interesting that you see that some of the models actually are performing worse depending on depending if you are male or female, and again, which color your skin has. And then it depends also kind of like, and this is something we also talk later on when we're talking about not the model, but about the system. What are kind of like the outputs of the system? Here, depending on how they use these consequences can actually be quite serious. So here is an AI system that has been used by judges to understand if they have a high risk of going to of recommitting a crime or not. And you see that kind of like people of color tend to have a higher risk, even though they have smaller crimes, and there tends to be a bias. So what is the idea of a bias? A bias really refers to systematic errors or anomalies in the output of a machine learning algorithm. So imagine this would be kind of like the truth that you want to have. And then if you have a bias, this is kind of like always the difference. Or just thinking about you're trying to hit a target, but you never miss in the center, but all around. And this would be kind of like the bias. And there are different ways how bias can basically come into our models or creep into kind of like our AI systems. And first of all, obviously, it's because our world might be tricky and we go into it step by step. Then through data, it can come into our AI models or systems through historical bias, representation bias. Then we have algorithmic bias, basically through AI. We have ranking bias, but also in basically when human review it and human work together with the system, bias can happen and can basically negatively impact our actions. Because just think about it. Would you like that you kind of like engage with a model and just because you come from a different region, your skin is a little bit different, or you have a different sexual orientation, the model is not working as good or as it actually should. And one of the big things that we have, how bias is actually coming in, is actually through our data. And I'm pretty sure everyone heard about this term, garbage in, garbage out. But there are different ways how actually bias can enter in our models. And let's have a look. So here's kind of like an overview. And I'm going to dive into all of them into a second, kind of like of different biases that we have along basically collecting our data, building our data sets, and then splitting them into training and testing, and then having our training data set, training our model, evaluating our model, and then actually using our models. And this can actually have effects that cause harm, and we want to minimize the harm that we're causing. So we want to make our models much, much better and much, much more accurate and less biased. I think it's probably, I'm not sure if it's 100% possible to get the bias out of the models, but at least let's try to make them as little biased as possible. Because I mean, the idea on which we're running is biased models create harm for certain people. And what we want to do when we're talking about AI ethics, we want to minimize the harm that we actually can create with those models. So the first kind of type of bias is the historical bias, sometimes also called societal or structural bias. This bias arises from societal norms, beliefs, and practices that have historically favored certain groups over others. So it's really embedded in the data we collect, often reflecting basically the real world or the system of discriminating. And one way how we can see this is that we quite often have certain discriminations against women historically, because I mean, a lot of women very late also were allowed to participate in the labor force. That had a lot of effects. And there's still kind of like the difference that we see. And if we train kind of like these models on the difference, these models will perpetuate the bias that we have. And this is an example from Amazon. What they did is basically they want to have kind of like a recruitment tool that would kind of like look at the candidates and suggest them different roles. And what they were seeing is kind of like in the past, we didn't have any women in high-paying executive roles. So this means this meant kind of like the algorithm wouldn't show those women as suitable for these now high-paying roles and would not suggest them. And obviously there is a bias. We can also see the bias in the real world happening in the application of in science. So here we see a study that has been done when gender identifying information was removed for applications for a research project or a research time at Hubble Space Telescope. We can basically see when kind of like the gender identifying information was removed, how the acceptance rate grew, which kind of like lets us lead to an example that we see certain discrimination all over. And this is something we don't really want to have in our models or reflect our models. Then we have a statistical representation or sampling bias. So this bias arises when certain groups or characteristics are overrepresented or underrepresented. I mean, if you think about it, and that's something we talked very much more in the beginning, how those models are trained. If I don't train them on a certain class, this class will not be appearing. And here's the example, basically. So here's Google Pictures, and they basically labeled those images, and there were just apparently more images of gorillas than of black peoples. And it's not that the algorithm per se is biased, but it has been trained or not trained on people of colors, and it just chose what was kind of like the most prevalent class that was closest, and it seemed to be gorillas. And it was very hard to get rid for Google to get rid of this, and they just kind of like took the gorillas class completely off. So not the best way how to solve it. Then what we also have is a measurement bias. That bias occurs when there are systematic errors in the way data is collected, recorded, or measured, leading to inconsistent and reproducible inaccuracies in the data. So there are different ways how this can happen. So we can have, this shouldn't be human errors, but I think there should be kind of like different labeled here. But we have human errors, malicious attacks. So it could also be kind of like people enter their information not correctly into a form. This happens actually quite often. Or if you make surveys and ask people, they might not respond honestly, or they might confuse the question. So if you ask people, for instance, hey, for a study, what is your salary? Some might think, okay, well, I'm asking for a netto salary, I'm asking for a brutto salary, maybe I'm asking for the monthly or the weekly salary, depending where I am. And this can lead to that you have errors. Or if you have measurements devices, if they're broken, all of these things can have errors, or there can be malicious attacks. Then if we go down below, what can we see? I mean, we have evaluation bias. This bias arises when metrics, data sets, or methods used to evaluate AI models' performance are skewed. So basically, if I try to evaluate them and this evaluation set is not really representative of what I'm seeing, then I have kind of like these challenges. What else do we have? We have aggregation bias. So if we aggregate data from diverse sources or groups, that means sometimes differences are aggregated out. So one of the best examples here is kind of like a study on how different nationalities or backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, have developed diabetes. And if you look at the total, right? So basically, this is, I think, that's outside of the US and it's not outside the US. If you look at the total, we have 25%, but it's much lower for the white and non-Hispanic, but as for the Hispanic. And if we would just take the average, this means we would lose kind of like this information, or this very kind of like important information that seems to be an ethnic difference if we just average those out. And this is one of the challenges that can happen. And then one of the last things that we're actually seeing that can happen is that we have something we call deployment bias. So that the models are not used in the way they're supposed to be used. And this is one of the examples. So this is actually a model that has been created to figure out, based on how people or what crimes the people have committed, and some of kind of like information about them, how likely they are to reoffend. Because this might be interesting for a judge when a person appears the first time for a judge, and when he has to decide, well, should I put this person in prison or should I not put the person in prison? And then the idea is, if I know that the person is, if I don't put the person in prison, he's very likely to reoffend within the next month, then probably I better should this person put the person in prison. The problem is how this has been used. It's kind of like here on the one hand side, trying to understand how high the risk is that someone is gonna do a reoffend. But this algorithm here in the example has not been necessarily used for this, but this has been used to decide should a person go to prison or not. And this is basically deployment. So it's not correctly used, or the use is very kind of like critical how it has been used. So what can we do kind of like to overcome the bias. And one of the obvious example is or answers that you often get is you should have much more diverse teams. They not only make better decisions, but they often think much more inclusive, and therefore they will pick up this bias and make sure, or are more likely to spot the bias and make sure that we don't have, because they want to they want to see the diversity of their teams also represented in the models that they're doing. Something else, and we're going to talk later a little bit about it, is also thinking about how you can use human in the loop systems. So you have an AI system and work, especially maybe with a human AI team with experts that look over kind of like some of the results, and we're going to speak about this in a later part. But as well, what has been quite helpful is very similar to what we have kind of like putting informations about the risk of anything on the back of things, that we also do this when we're talking about artificial intelligence. So we have kind of like things where it says watch for eyes, or these are the nutritional effects. And this is what we're talking about when talking about AI model cards. So if people are using the system, that you have very clear cards where you say, okay, well, what is the objective of this model that they're using? Where does it work well? Where does it not work well? For instance, it could be, well, the pictures that we have taken of the model were all during the day, so don't expect it to use it during the night because it will just not work well. And if I know this, then I can completely different engage with it. Or very similar, if I have something algorithm in the medical field, if they say, okay, well, this has never been trained on data of children, so you should not use it on data on children, people will not misuse it because they understand how to use it. So it's very important, and it's kind of like starting to become a good practice to include these things. We see this even in GPT-4. There are the GPT-4 system cards that kind of like explain what are kind of like the challenges, how to overcome the challenges, and so on. Something that is also important, and I haven't been talking about yet, is the topic of security when it comes to AI, because AI is kind of like working a little bit different than we tend to anthropomorphize the results that we're getting. And what we basically have here kind of like is thinking about how we have what we call these adversarial attacks. So how we can use AI, or kind of like how we can manipulate the results we're getting out of AI. And here you see one example from computer vision. Maybe in the street you have a stop sign, and this is a stop sign. How it can look in the street, you see kind of like it's spade on, but you still understand it as stop sign. But if we can run this through AI and basically use something very similar, so for us it would not kind of like look that it has been much altered. For us it would still be a stop sign, but because it's an adversarial attack and they're kind of like pixels, the AI now reads speed limit sign 45 miles, or just kind of like putting these plots on here. And this can create a lot of danger. And we should think about how, if you build something, what are kind of like threats to the security of your system. And these are things you might have to be aware and ask yourself once you're building something. And here kind of like just different examples, how you can just add a little bit of noise that is unrecognizable for us as people. And out of the panda, suddenly we have a gibbon. Very similar here, just a couple of examples, just a small sticker, and the toaster is seen as a banana, or we can't just kind of like this glasses here, and we will not recognize their faces anymore, or wearing this pullover, you don't see the people anymore. So, and I find this very interesting how people kind of like examples, how people actually have used different ways or try to kind of like fool those models. And this is something, if you train your model and you kind of like think about how this model is going to use and going to use in action, just think about how you can kind of like circumvent, or how you can basically attack your own model to make it better and to improve it. And I think this is just a very hilarious example where the Marines tried out a DARPA robot, and they went around by hiding in boxes and box surfing to actually get around unidentified. So this is so much when it comes to AI. Now we also have to think about the system. And I think I stop after the system part because I see that I'm slowly running over. But I think there's probably the biggest learning in there. And I think it's very interesting because often when we're talking about AI, we just think about the output of a model and not necessarily so much about the action this model can trigger. So let's talk a little bit, not about the AI models, but about the AI product that we're building. And to make things a little bit more clear and understandable, I want to give you this example of the New York Times, or that it has been written in the New York Times and by Google. So basically in the US, all the providers of phones, they are required to automatically scan, basically scan all the images that you're seeing and see if they contain child pornography or not. And obviously this is not they're like, if you think about just my mom, how many pictures she takes a day, it's impossible for people to do it. So they have developed an AI algorithm that can detect if an image that you take on your phone is an example of child pornography or not child pornography. And this example that made it into kind of like the New York Times, sorry, not the Business Insider, but the New York Times, is the story of a dad during Corona. He has a 1-year-old toddler, and the toddler got a rash in the genital area. And he asked the doctor what he should do, and the doctor said, well, you don't have to come. Why don't you just send me a picture, and I tell you if this is something, a serious rash, or I tell you kind of like if you can just get a cream in the pharmacy and all that is fine. So he did this. He took a picture of his toddler, sent it to his doctor, and the algorithm flagged him as basically child pornography. And what happened then, they locked him out of his accounts, and he was a Google user. He had a Google phone, so they locked him out of his Google phone. They locked him out of his Google email. He lost all access to his Google Drive and everything. And the police came to his door because they thought he was kind of like a pedophile. So very, 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 very like not so nice if this happens to you. And if you're not a pedophile, he could show the police very easily that he was not a pedophile. Just kind of explain the situation. The problem, and this is the story about, that happened is that he didn't get all his account back on Google, and it took him months, and I still don't know if he got his accounts back. It never wrote about it. And this is something that's very important to understand. That and I'm going to talk in a second, but not going away from the output, but going into the actions that a model can have. So basically, what we think about, what we have here is a model that predicts whether an image contains child pornography or not. This is what the model does, but it has triggered 2 actions, right? So if the model says it's child pornography, the action it will trigger is report to police, log out of all accounts. And this seems to be happen automatically. And it says in here, no child pornography, do nothing. And what we need to understand, in order to evaluate those models and have an understanding for them, we especially need to look out in the example, so it can help us kind of like putting it down as a confusion matrix and understanding what is the ground truth and what is the predicted class. So was this an example of child pornography really or not? And then kind of like on what did the model say? And then really trying to understand what can go wrong, because these are the things you have to look out for, right? You don't have to look out for if the model is right, because then it's performing correctly. But we have to look out for what happens actually if the model makes mistakes, right? So because we don't want it to make mistakes. But what is very crucial to understand, and this I find very interesting, we always talking about, so far we have been talking about how do we get bias out of the model. So what we're doing is we're trying to work before the product is in action. So we're trying to think about how we can improve the accuracy of a model. But just think about it. Even if a model is 99.999% accurate, right? So, and if you're, even then it will make mistakes. And just think about the example of the child pornography. Even if you look over 1 million images, and easily you look over 1 million images a day, then this means you still make 1,000 mistakes. So you should understand those models are not perfect, and they will always make mistakes. And quite often we speak about how can we reduce the mistakes before they happen. But what you have to understand, the model will make mistakes, regardless what you try to do before. So we should also think about how can we act, or what can we do if the model has made mistakes, to reduce the mistakes. And that was the problem Google didn't do. So in order to do this, we need to understand what happens if the model is wrong. So here in our class, what we have, there is benign content incorrectly identified as child pornography. So there's no child pornography incorrectly identified as child pornography. And here there is actually child pornography images, and they are actually not identified as images. And then we have to understand, okay, well, what is happening and what are kind of like the actions that are triggered and what are the results to judge those algorithms and understand how we should work with this. And here in the example, just think about it. I mean, here where we are, the example of the dad, that means, okay, what we have seen here is the false positive, so ban content incorrectly identified as illegal. So, and this can lead to undue distress and potential legal issues and requires careful review processes. So here, what we could have done in order to prevent is just have a hotline where you can easily call someone and they can redo this, or they can change basically what they have and can give them back the access. So it's super easy, actually, once you know this can happen. And it's okay to happen, right? It can make mistakes, but you should make sure that at least you can avoid or can minimize the mistakes once they're done. So there can be a hotline or whatever, and you should have a person in charge that knows how they can get the access back. And then we also have the other one where we have to think about is, well, what we have here is the model is making a mistake and doesn't identify the child pornography. Even this can happen, but the question is also, well, what is the second best option? And the second best option is not having this model, and not having this model means, well, there would be a lot more illegal content that gets classified. So I think this always is very helpful to think about, well, what are the consequences and how I should act? And this is an exercise I do with every startup when they build, kind of like thinking about what are the negative consequences if the model makes mistakes. And what we also know, and what we also kind of understand is also before how we can avoid them, right? Because here it's not so, it's annoying if this happens, but this will happen. There is really kind of like something, much more kind of like so again, sorry. So here it's okay that this can happen, but this will happen. It's not good that it's happened, but it can happen. And we try to make our models as good as possible to obviously reduce this. But the mistake, so if we make a mistake here, no one single individual will be harmed. Instead, here, people will be harmed. So we can also think about, is this an action we want to automate, right? So this is an output of the model, and we have to think about the action or trigger. So the output of the model, again, was, well, I think this is child pornography. And then the action you have, okay, lock him out of his accounts, report him to the police. And this action, the problem was that what happened here was that action was completely automated, right? So there are different ways or degrees how you can automate something where you have full delegation to AI. And apparently here he was automatically locked out of all his accounts, and this was problematic. Or is this a decision support where kind of like the machine says, well, look at this image. Do you really think that was someone? Or you have kind of like a degree of confidence where it says, okay, well, I'm up to 90% confident that this is kind of like child pornography. No one has to look at it. I'm 90% confident that this is no child pornography. And then in the middle, there's somewhere the range where it's not totally sure what it is. And there we have kind of like a human that supports and makes the things better. And this is what we call human in the loop. And this would be something I would have been talking a little bit more about it, but we're already running a little bit late. And I want to keep you asking some questions. So this means I hope you enjoyed a little bit of insights into how we look at kind of like applied AI ethics. If you're much more interested in this topic, I have actually a very big canvas about all of these topics and kind of like a checklist where you can go through and see what are the risks and so on. And if you're interested in this canvas, then connect with me on LinkedIn and write me a message, and I will send the canvas to you. And then I go back now to your questions.
I think we had a question from Alexander who was mentioning he was saying something about the 40 different answers on a particular GDPR issue. And as there is a lot of, I'm not sure what that is exactly, WP29 EDP guidance.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this is just very extreme, and this is something you will notice. It's not probably that this is obviously an extreme example. So the idea here is that that even though you have GDPR, it's often not very clear what this means. Even though you have this kind of like this legislation, how you can lay out this legislation means is often not very clear, and this is a challenge that will also come up with the AI Act, right? So even saying, okay, well, this system is high risk or low risk or mid risk, it's not 100% clear. And if you ask one expert, he might say yes. If you say another expert, he might say yes, probably you have to look at this thing. And this is the challenge. It's not with GDPR and also with the AI Act, it's not going to be one black or white, but somewhere in between, and it depends a little bit on interpretation. And because everyone has a slightly different kind of like opinion about this, you will get different interpretations, and some people will tell you can do this, and some other people can tell you can't do this. And this is why I'm saying your question should not be, can I do this or can I not do this, but rather, what do I have to do in order to be able to do this? And then this helps you much more to find creative ways around it. And this is very much what you experience. I mean, if you speak with a lot of people, you will see that everyone has a slightly different interpretation of the GDPR on kind of like some certain context.
Thank you. Maybe if there are other questions from the other people, feel free. There's no wrong answer or wrong question. Sorry, there's only good answers, but no wrong question. I think we don't. All right. Well, also feel free if you're interested in AI in general to check out our trainings in machine learning and AI data science at Data Scientist, or simply to take the placement test, or just simply to look our blog with we have a lot more information on the topic. So feel free to have a look. All right. I think we're good. No more questions. All right.
Perfect. Then thank you so much. It was great to be here again, to be invited again, and yeah, always happy to connect again on LinkedIn and so on. And I wish you a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Thank you, Tristan. Bye-bye.
Bye.